When we're talking about the resurrection accounts in the Gospel as myth, we're in a world where fact and fiction are being dealt with in a very subtle way. In contemporary literature, we sometimes talk about faction, a combination of a historical event being dealt with in a fictionalized way, so that new characters are introduced perhaps. But when we talk about the resurrection accounts as myth, we're not quite in the world of faction. And we're also a very long way from the world of fake news, which is so much in the media at the moment. What we're saying when we're talking about the resurrection accounts as myth is that it's not so much about what happened that's important, but about the significance of the events, what they meant to those people who wanted to write them down and think about them further. In ancient history, we find that historiography is dealt with in a very different way from the way that we find today, where events and their interpretation are gathered together and mingled, so that to separate them out is very difficult. But again, when we're talking about the resurrection accounts as myth, we're not quite in the world of ancient history either. We're in a world where fact and fiction are not the important categories, and instead what we have is significance. And perhaps the most important and the most well-known mythological events in the Bible are the events of the creation stories in Genesis, where some people take them literally, many do not, and see them instead as a way of describing the providential care of God for his creation. Now, the person who's most clearly identified with the resurrection accounts being categorized as myth is a man called Rudolf Bultmann, who lived from 1884 till 1976. And for him, the events of the life of Jesus are much less important for faith than their significance. And he would say that all of the supernatural events described in the Gospels, the miracles and the resurrection accounts, are a sort of overlay on the life of Jesus, and that scientific humanity wants to take away that overlay and to get to the real truth, the real meaning that the original writers were trying to represent. And so that the resurrection as a myth is trying to explain the fact of the crucifixion. And that for him was key, that Jesus Christ was crucified. And then what happened afterwards is an attempt to understand the significance of that fact. Now, Bultmann's views were very, very significant and very influential in the 20th century, perhaps less popular today, and that category of myth has been rethought, and people have looked at non-canonical Gospels, which are much more mythological than the Gospels that we have in our New Testament canon. And perhaps the most interesting one is the Gospel of Peter, where we get myth writ large. Here we have a great crowd of witnesses watching the empty tomb, watching the tomb in the period between the death of Jesus and those strange sightings of him, apparently after he has been resurrected. There's crowds of witnesses. Two men come down from heaven in the Gospel of Peter, and they go into the tomb and they bring out a third person, a third man whose mythological status is demonstrated by the fact that his head goes right up to the clouds, and he is the resurrected Christ. And if that's not enough, then out of the tomb comes a cross, and there's a voice from heaven saying to the cross, "Have you preached to those who are asleep?" And the cross says, "Yes, I have." So there's the Gospel of Peter. Most people think it was written in the 2nd century. A few scholars take it to be even earlier than the Gospels that we have, but the scholarly consensus is that it comes from a much later period than our canonical Gospels. And here you get that development of myth that Bultmann sees much more clearly in the Gospels as we have them. But the Gospels themselves, compared to the Gospel of Peter, their accounts are spare. They're very clean and clear, which isn't to say that they don't have mythological elements about them, but they're a very different sort of genre from the Gospel of Peter. And the other witness that we have, the written witness, is from Paul, of course, writing some decades before the Gospels were brought together, but very clearly writing in 1 Corinthians that Jesus rose according to the Scriptures, and that if he didn't, then there is little point in his faith. So for him, the fact of the resurrection doesn't need to be dressed up in mythological terms, although we should note that he does use that enigmatic phrase, according to the Scriptures. And scholars have wondered what exactly he was meaning when he talked about according to the Scriptures. What does that refer to? But from our purposes here, what's significant is that he too needs another way to understand that strange event. He too needs a meta-narrative, an overarching thought process that which he can use to categorize this unusual event. So what we get from Paul is the suggestion that there is no early version of the resurrection story or the Jesus story that doesn't have that supernatural element of the resurrection story. It's not a case that there was an early version and to which that has been added, the story of the resurrection. From really very early on, that seems to have been integral to the story of Jesus, certainly the story of Jesus that Paul has and lives by. And he uses this phrase, according to the Scriptures, which again suggests that there is a bigger narrative into which the story fits. But he too will use metaphorical language when he talks about the general resurrection. So he has the metaphor of waking up from sleep, or he has the metaphor of plants coming from the buried seed. So although it's not quite mythological terms, he does use metaphorical terms to describe this idea of rising from the dead. And that we're not terribly far there, really, are we, from the pictures of Easter cards where we have chicks coming out of eggs and we have spring flowers representing the movement from winter into spring. And let's not forget that there are some mythical elements even in the Gospel accounts. In Matthew, we have an angel. In Luke, we have two strange figures. And we have Jesus appearing as if out of nowhere. And then most significantly, in John's Gospel, we've got Mary at the tomb, and she thinks that she sees the gardener. She mistakes Jesus as the gardener. And some people have seen in that account a rewriting of the Genesis story, a mythological rewinding of that story of origins that has crept into John's understanding of what the resurrection is all about. And I think, of course, having just recently been in Jerusalem, where I visited both the Garden Tomb and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, two very opposing ways of understanding, of interpreting, of responding to the idea of the resurrection of Jesus, and that process that we see in the Gospels and in later literature. It continues today. So for most scholars, however, of the Gospels, we believe that the early Christian writers, they knew about the category of myth, but for them the resurrection stories were more than a myth, but not less than a myth either.